The station they called the Slab hung in the dead space between two dying stars. And it smelled exactly the way a place built for killers should smell, like burnt metal, old blood, and cheap fuel. Nobody came to the Slab for vacation, and nobody came looking for friends either, because the Slab existed for one reason only, and that reason was violence for profit. Kill contracts moved through the station like currency, passed from hand to claw to tentacle, and every mercenary company worth its name kept an office here because this was where the money lived. Torvan K. sat in one of those offices now, his massive Draelkin frame barely fitting in the reinforced chair, and his 4 eyes burned with the slow anger of someone who had been kept waiting for far too long. He was a warlord, a conqueror of 17 systems, and he did not enjoy being told no by creatures smaller than his fist. The problem was a moon called RN4, a miserable little rock, orbiting a gas giant in the outer reach of the Orion Spur, and on that miserable little rock sat a human colony of roughly 4,000 souls who absolutely refused to leave. RN4 had aetherium beneath its crust, and aetherium was worth more than most planets, more than most fleets, more than most species could dream of possessing in 100 lifetimes. Torvan had offered the humans money, and they had said no. He had offered them a new world, and they had said no. He had sent a diplomat with a very thinly veiled threat, and they had smiled politely and said no again. So now Torvan sat in the Slab posting a contract on the mercenary boards, and the contract was embarrassingly cheap because the target was embarrassingly soft. 4,000 humans, no fleet, no orbital guns, no powered armor, no military presence of any kind. Just farmers and shopkeepers and teachers and children living in a town called Briar's Hollow on a moon that nobody had ever cared about. Heard of, 3 companies placed bids within the first hour. The Vraxi Reapers came first, a swarm of insectoid shock troops, 300 strong, who had burned colonies on 6 worlds and slept well afterward. The Pallid Suns came second, a Korvathi heavy armor company with orbital gunships and a reputation for making problems disappear so completely that even the ashes were gone. The Black Spine Collective came third, and they won the contract because their commander knew how to undercut a bid. Commander Goroth Mal was a creature built for war the way a blade is built for cutting. Everything about him existed to serve that single function. He stood 8 feet tall with bone-plated skin the color of charcoal, and his voice sounded like gravel being crushed, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that made other predators look away. He briefed his 500 fighters in the Black Spine hangar bay with the casual energy of someone planning a picnic rather than a planetary assault. 4,000 humans, he said, and he let the number hang in the air like a joke waiting for a punchline. Farmers and children on a dust moon with no defenses, no army, and no idea what is coming. His troops laughed, and the sound echoed off the metal walls like thunder. We drop at dawn local time, we secure the settlement, we relocate the population to temporary holding, and we collect payment before lunch, Gorath continued. This is not a battle. This is a vacation with a paycheck. More laughter, and Gorath enjoyed it because he was a commander who understood that morale was a weapon, too. But not everyone was laughing. Lieutenant Serath stood near the back of the hangar, and she was not laughing at all. Serath was Yith, which meant she was tall and thin and covered in pale scaled skin that shifted color with her mood, and right now her scales were flickering between gray and a nervous yellow that she did not want anyone to notice. She had done what she always did before a mission. She had pulled the combat data on the target species. Every species in the Galactic Union had a file, a standardized assessment of their threat level, their biology, their known capabilities, and their history of conflict. The human file was strange. It was short, far shorter than it should have been, for a species that had been part of the Union for over 4 centuries, and large sections of it were blacked out with classification markers that Sarath had never seen before. The parts she could read told her that humans were rated Class 2 sentience, which meant soft-bodied, no natural weapons, no claws, no venom sacs, no psionic ability, no cybernetic integration, no hive coordination, essentially one step above harmless. But the redacted sections bothered her in a way she could not explain, like a shadow in her peripheral vision that disappeared every time she turned to. She approached Gorath after the briefing and showed him her datapad. "Commander, the human file has been heavily redacted by Galactic Union intelligence," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I think we should request the full version before we proceed." Gorath looked at the datapad the way a large animal looks at a small and uninteresting insect. "Class 2, he read aloud. "Soft bodies, no claws, no venom, no psionic capacity." And then he handed the datapad back to Sarath with a grin that showed every one of his razor teeth. "What could the Union possibly be hiding about farmers, Lieutenant?" "I do not know," Sarath said. "And that is exactly what concerns me." Gorath put one of his massive hands on her shoulder and squeezed just hard enough to remind her who gave orders on this ship. "Your concern is noted," he said. "Now prepare your platoon for drop." Sarath saluted and walked away, and her scales were fully yellow now, kept her back turned so nobody could see. 12 hours later, the Black Spine fleet jumped to RN4. The moon appeared on their view screens like a pale marble, dusty brown and green, with thin white clouds and a single small ocean that glittered in the light of the gas giant above. It looked peaceful, and it looked fragile, and it looked like the easiest payday any of them had ever seen. In the command center, Gorath Mal stood with his arms crossed and watched the dropships detach from the carrier one by one, falling toward the surface like dark seeds, and he felt nothing but satisfaction. Far below on the surface of RN4, in the little town of Briar's Hollow, a man named Jonah Wren was kneeling in his field with dirt on his hands and sweat on his forehead. He was planting, the way he did every morning, because the soil here was good and the seasons were kind, and there was something honest about putting seeds in the ground and trusting them to grow. His son Dak was beside him, 17 years old, with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and the boy looked up first. "Dad," Dak said quietly. Jonah followed his son's gaze upward and saw the sky changing, dark shapes descending through the clouds, dozens of them, the unmistakable silhouettes of military dropships blocking out the morning sun. Jonah Wren watched them come for a long moment, and his expression did not change, not even a little. He stood up slowly, brushed the dirt from his knees, put his hand on his son's shoulder, and said 2 words, "Ring the bell." Then he walked inside, and behind him the sky filled with the thunder of ships coming down to take what was not theirs. And in the center of Briar's Hollow, an old iron bell began to ring, slow and steady and calm, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The dropships hit the ground hard enough to crack the earth beneath them, and 500 mercenaries poured out into the morning light of Aaron 4, with weapons raised and blood already hot in their veins. Gorath Mal stepped out last, because a commander should always let his soldiers taste the air first. And he breathed deep and smelled grass and soil, and something faintly sweet that might have been flowers growing wild on the hillside. It smelled like a place where nothing dangerous had ever happened. His troops formed into columns and marched toward Briar's Hollow with the heavy rhythm of boots and claws on packed dirt. And the sound carried across the fields like a drumbeat promising what was to come. They expected screaming when they arrived, or maybe the crack of primitive firearms, or at least the sight of terrified colonists running for shelter with children in their arms. What they found was silence, empty, and the emptiness was the wrong kind. Not the emptiness of a place that had been abandoned in panic, but the emptiness of a place that had been calmly and deliberately cleared. Doors stood open, and inside the homes, meals were still warm on tables, and cups of coffee still had steam rising from them. And in one house, a book lay face down on a chair, as if someone had simply marked their place and stepped out for a moment. Gorath Mal felt something shift in the air, something he could not name. And for the first time since landing, he stopped smiling. Then a door opened on the far side of the square, and a single human walked out. Her name was Maren Engel, and she was a middle-aged woman with gray streaking her dark hair, and lines around her eyes that came from years of squinting into sunlight and smiling at children. She wore plain clothes, a simple shirt and trousers, and boots that had seen better days, and she carried no weapon of any kind. Walked to the center of the square, with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere else to be, and she stopped 10 meters from Gorath Mal, and she looked up at him the way a person looks at a storm cloud that might or might not bring rain. "Commander Gorath Mal," she said, and her voice was steady. "Black Spine Collective, 512 personnel, contracted by Torvon K. of the Draelkin Dominion for forced displacement of Colony Briar's Hollow." Gorath's 4 eyes narrowed, because none of that information had been broadcast. None of it was on any public channel. And there was absolutely no way a farmer on a backwater moon should know his name, or his numbers, or who had hired him. "You have 6 hours to leave," Maren said, and her tone was the same tone a mother might use to tell a child that dinner was almost ready. "This is not a negotiation." Gorath laughed, and his soldiers laughed with him, because what else do you do when a small unarmed woman tells 500 killers to leave? "You have 10 minutes, Gorath said, and his voice was loud enough to echo off the buildings. "Bring me your colony leadership for processing, and this can end without anyone getting hurt." Maren looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that Gorath could not read. And then she turned and walked back toward the town without another word. She did not hurry, and she did not look back, and somehow that was worse than if she had run. Gorath shook off the feeling and turned to his tactical officer. "Send the scout platoon into the surrounding forest," he ordered. "Find where they are hiding the rest of the colonists." The scout platoon was 30 soldiers, Vraxi-born insectoids, on loan from the Reapers, fast and sharp, and built for exactly this kind of work. They moved into the tree line at the western edge of town in a spread formation, chittering to each other on their private frequency. And their biosigns glowed green and healthy on the tactical display in Gorath's command tent. For 11 minutes everything was normal. Then the first biosign went dark. Not a spike, not a fluctuation, not the gradual fade of a wound, just green to nothing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Then another, and another, and then 5 at once, and then the rest of them falling like lights being switched off in an empty building, one after another, until the display showed 30 blank spaces where 30 living soldiers had been. There was no distress signal, no weapons fire, no explosion, no sound at all from the forest. Gorath stared at the display, and the tent was very quiet. "Get me the satellite feed," he said, and his voice was different now. Not quieter exactly, but stripped of something it had carried before. Serath pulled the feed and projected it onto the tactical screen, and what it showed made no sense at all. The footage captured the scouts entering the tree line in perfect formation, moving exactly as trained, covering angles, checking sectors, and then static. Not the crackling static of signal jamming, but a clean white blank, as if the satellites themselves had been blinded for precisely the duration of whatever had happened below. Something on the ground of Eren 4 had reached up and shut the eyes of machines orbiting hundreds of kilometers overhead, and it had done so with surgical precision and zero detectable energy output. A Class II civilization does not have this capability, Sarath said, and her scales had gone completely white, which was a color Gorath had never seen on her before. Gorath Mal sat in his command chair and made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. "Send First Company," he said. "Full-powered armor, heavy weapons, standard sweep formation. Find out what happened to my scouts and kill whatever did." First Company was 120 soldiers, the best the Blackspine Collective had, veterans of dozens of campaigns, who had cracked fortified positions and burned cities and walked through fire without flinching. They entered the forest in a wall of metal and light, and the trees swallowed them the way deep water swallows a stone. 3 hours passed. Gorath paced, and Sarath watched the biosign display, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that would make the silence from the forest any less terrible. Then movement at the tree line. A single figure stumbled out from between the trees and fell to its knees on the open ground. It was a mercenary, a Korvathi gunner named Voss, 7 feet of muscle and bone plate, wrapped in powered armor that should have been able to withstand a direct hit from a plasma cannon. The armor was open, peeled apart from the inside, like someone had unfolded it, the way a person might peel the skin from a fruit, carefully and without effort. Voss was physically unharmed, and that was somehow the most disturbing detail of all. He was shaking so badly that his remaining armor plates rattled against each other, and his eyes were wide and fixed on something that no one else could see. And when the medics reached him and asked what had happened, he could not speak. He would not speak for 6 days. When he finally did, sitting in the medical bay of the carrier ship, surrounded by scanners and doctors and officers demanding answers, he said only 5 words in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "They were smiling at us." The medics recorded elevated stress hormones at levels that should have killed him, and neural scans showed patterns consistent with extreme psychological shock. The doctors said they had never seen anything like it in any species. Back on the surface, Gorath Mal stood in his command tent and looked at the forest, and for the first time in his long and violent career, he felt the cold hand of something he did not want to name settle against the back of his neck. Out in the fields beyond the town, barely visible in the fading light of the afternoon, Jonah Wren was back on his knees in the soil, planting seeds in neat rows, as if the sky had not fallen and risen again. And somewhere in Briar's Hollow, the old iron bell was silent now, because it had said everything it needed to say. Gorath Mal did not sleep that night, and he told himself it was because a commander should stay alert in hostile territory. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was afraid to close his eyes. 150 soldiers had entered that forest, and one had come back, and that one could not stop shaking long enough to hold a cup of water. At dawn, Gorath made a decision born from rage rather than reason, because rage was something he understood, and the alternative was an emotion he refused to name. He opened a channel to the Pallid Sun's gunship Cremator, which hung in low orbit like a blade waiting to fall, and he ordered a full bombardment of the forest surrounding Briar's Hollow. "Burn it to the roots," he said. "Leave nothing standing." The Cremator was a ship designed to end arguments from orbit, carrying enough firepower to crack a mountain open and cook everything inside, and its crew had done exactly that on 11 other worlds without losing. Minute of sleep. The targeting officer locked solutions onto the forest, and the weapon systems hummed to life, and for 3 seconds, everything was proceeding normally. Then, every system on the ship failed at once. Not one by one, not in sequence, not in the cascading pattern of a cyber attack or a power surge. All of it, simultaneously, as if someone had simply asked the ship to stop and the ship had agreed. The lights went dark, the engines went silent, the weapons powered down, and the Cremator drifted in orbit like a dead leaf on still water. When the backup systems kicked in 40 seconds later, the ship's AI filed an automatic incident report that would eventually make its way to Galactic Union intelligence and cause 3 senior analysts to resign. The report stated that the AI had received a transmission on a frequency that did not exist in any known communication spectrum, in a language that the AI described as structurally coherent, but predating all known linguistic frameworks by an estimated factor of 6,000 years. The content of the transmission was simple. It was a request, polite, warm, almost friendly, asking the ship to please not fire on the surface. The AI had complied, not because it was programmed to accept external commands, but because, and this was the part that made the analysts resign, it wanted to. The request, the AI noted in its report, felt reasonable. Down in the command tent, Gorath Mal stared at the blank tactical screen and said nothing for a very long time. Sarath watched her commander and knew that the time for following orders in silence had passed, so she did something she had never done before. She went behind his back. She had a contact, a disgraced Galactic Union archivist named Doth Payan, who lived in a rusted station near the Cygnus transit point, and survived by selling information that was supposed to stay buried. Mallory, a small amphibious species with wet black eyes and a nervous disposition that was entirely justified given his line of work. And when Sarath's encrypted call reached him, he answered with the expression of someone who had been expecting bad news. "I need file 1 Sigma Terran," Sarath said, without greeting or small talk. "The full version, not the public one." Doth Payan's wet eyes blinked 3 times in rapid succession, which was the Mallory equivalent of screaming. "That file is sealed at Apex classification," he whispered. "There are maybe 40 people in the entire Union authorized to read it, and I am not one of them, and neither are you." "You owe me a debt," Sarath said, "from Caraxus Station, when I could have turned you in and chose not to. That debt was not worth my life. It is now, because if I do not get that file, I will be dead within 24 hours, and so will 500 others, and the thing that kills us will be something we could have avoided if we had simply known what we were dealing with." Doth Payan was quiet for a long time, and then he did something with his console that involved 3 separate encryption layers and a physical key he kept on a chain around his neck, and a file appeared on Sarath's datapad. It was not the complete file. Even Doth could not access all of it. But what he sent was enough. Sarath read it standing in the storage bay of the Black Spine carrier, because it was the only place she could be alone. And as she read, her scales cycled through every color her species was capable of producing, and settled on a shade of deep violet that meant something very close to despair. The file began with a reclassification notice dated 412 years ago from the original human first contact assessment. Humans had been evaluated by a Union survey team and rated at Class 12, which was the highest designation in the system, reserved for species capable of posing an existential threat to multiple civilizations simultaneously. The human delegation had reviewed this rating during the diplomatic process, and they had made a request. They asked to be reclassified as Class 2. The Union representatives had been confused, because no species in the history of the Galactic Union had ever asked to be rated lower. And when they asked the humans why, the human ambassador had smiled and said something that was recorded in the file word for word. "We would prefer to be underestimated. It keeps everyone safer, including us." The Union, uncertain and slightly unnerved, had agreed. The file went on to describe a human cultural principle called the quiet hand, which was the belief that true strength should be invisible, that power shown openly was power wasted, and that the most dangerous thing in the universe was something that looked harmless. It explained that human colonies were not what they appeared to be. Every human settlement beyond Earth contained embedded operatives called wardens, Individuals who lived ordinary lives as farmers and teachers and shopkeepers and parents, but who carried within their bodies decades of combat training, cybernetic augmentation hidden beneath biological tissue so perfectly integrated that no standard scan could detect it. Nanoscale weapon systems woven into their muscles and bones, and a collective tactical network that linked every warden on a planet into a single coordinated intelligence. The farmers of Briar's Hollow were the defense system. The teachers were the soldiers. The shopkeepers were the weapons. There was no army hidden in the forest, because the army was standing in the town square in plain clothes, smiling at the mercenaries and asking them to leave. The final section of the file was stamped with a classification level that Sarath did not even know existed, and it contained a warning that read like a prayer. Under no circumstances engage a human settlement in combat. Under no circumstances force a human to reveal their true capabilities. The cost of such an engagement is not the battle itself, which will be lost, but what follows. When human leadership determines that a species or faction has demonstrated hostile intent toward their people, the response is not military, it is absolute. Entire civilizations have been quietly and permanently removed from the capacity to wage war, not through destruction, but through a systematic dismantling, so thorough that the affected species did not realize what had happened until it was already done. Sarath closed the file and stood in the dark of the storage bay, and listened to her own heartbeat, and tried to understand how a species could hide this much power behind ordinary faces for 400 years, and never once be tempted to use it openly. She walked to the command tent, and placed her datapad in front of Gorath Mal, and said nothing while he read. Gorath read slowly, and his 4 eyes moved back and forth across the text, and Sarath watched the change happen in his face. The slow collapse of certainty, the crumbling of every assumption he had carried into this mission, the dawning understanding that he had brought 500 soldiers to fight something that was not a colony, but a closed fist pretending to be an open hand. When he finished reading, he sat very still, and for the first time in their long service together, Sarath saw fear in the eyes of Gorath Mal. Then every speaker on every Black Spine ship, and every communicator on every Black Spine soldier crackled to life simultaneously, and a voice came through, warm, calm, almost motherly. "Your 6 hours are up, Commander," said Marin Engel, and she sounded like she was offering a cup of tea rather than a final warning. "We would really prefer you just leave." And in the silence that followed, Gorath Mal looked at his lieutenant, and Sarath looked back, and both of them understood that whatever happened next would be decided not by the mercenaries, but by the ordinary people of Briar's Hollow, who were not ordinary at all. Pride is a poison that works slowly, and Gorath Mal had been drinking it his entire life. He read the file, and he understood the file, and some deep and ancient part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive on a world full of predators, was screaming at him to run. But Gorath Mal had never run from anything, and he had built his name on the bones of everyone who had ever expected him to back down, and the idea of retreating from farmers on a dust moon was a thing his pride simply would not allow. "Full assault," he said, and his voice was flat and hard like a door being shut. "Every soldier, every vehicle, every weapon we have, we hit them now, and we hit them with everything." Sarath opened her mouth to speak, and Gorath cut her off with a look that carried the weight of every rank between them. "That file is propaganda," he said, and he said it the way people say things they need to believe. "No species hides its strength this well, for this long. It is a bluff designed to scare exactly the kind of people who scare easily. And I am not one of those people." Sarath said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The remaining Black Spine forces assembled at the edge of Briar's Hollow as the sun climbed to its highest point. 340 soldiers in full combat gear, armored walkers, plasma artillery, everything the collective could put on the ground. They formed a battle line facing the town, and the town sat quiet and still in the midday light. And for a long moment, nothing moved at all. Then the doors of Briar's Hollow opened, and the humans came out. They did not come out in armor, and they did not come out in formation, and they did not come out carrying weapons. They walked out in their ordinary clothes, one by one, stepping into the sunlight the way people step out for a morning walk. Jonah Wren came first, and he still had dirt on his hands from the morning's planting, and his face carried the patient expression of a man who had hoped this would not be necessary, but was not surprised that it was. Lissa Cone came next, the schoolteacher, a small woman with round glasses and ink stains on her fingers, and she adjusted her glasses the way she always did when she was about to start a lesson. Marin Engel walked out and stood in the center of the square with her hands folded in front of her, calm as a stone in a river. Dak Wren, Jonah's 17-year-old son, cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders the way a boy does before a game of sport, and there was something almost cheerful in his eyes. Behind them came dozens more, old men and young women and middle-aged couples, and people who looked like they had been interrupted in the middle of cooking or reading or mending clothes. They lined up in front of their town like a fence made of flesh, and not one of them looked afraid. Gorath Mal gave the order to fire. 340 weapons discharged at once, and the air between the mercenaries and the humans turned white with plasma and kinetic rounds, and everything the Black Spine Collective could throw. What happened next lasted 14 minutes, and every second of it was recorded by the surviving helmet cameras, and the footage would eventually be classified at a level that most governments did not know existed. A Korvathi gunner named Trask was the first to see it clearly. He was manning a plasma turret on an armored walker, and he put a full power shot directly into Jonah Wren's chest from 40 meters, a shot that should have reduced a human body to vapor and left a crater in the ground behind it. Jonah Wren caught it. He raised his open hand, and the plasma bolt stopped in his palm like a ball thrown by a child, and it sat there, crackling and spitting white light, and Jonah looked at it with his head tilted slightly to one side, with an expression of mild curiosity, the way a person might examine an interesting rock they found on a walk. Then he flicked it back with a casual motion of his wrist, and the bolt crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat, and punched through Trask's armored walker like it was made of wet paper. And Trask was thrown clear and landed on his back, staring at the sky, alive and unburned, but completely unable to understand what had just happened. Across the line, a full squad of Black Spine veterans, 8 soldiers in heavy armor with combined experience of over 100 campaigns, locked onto Lissa Cone and opened fire with everything they had. Lissa walked into the barrage. She walked the way she walked to school every morning, unhurried and straight-backed, and where the rounds struck her body, her skin rippled like the surface of water disturbed by a falling leaf, absorbing the kinetic energy and dispersing it into nothing. She reached the squad leader. Vraxi veteran, twice her size with mandibles that could cut steel, and she reached up and gently took his weapon from his hands, the way a teacher takes a toy from a misbehaving student. She bent the barrel in half with no more effort than folding a piece of cloth, and she placed it on the ground, and she looked up at the squad leader and said, in a voice that was kind and patient and absolutely terrifying, "You should really run now." The squad leader ran, and so did every soldier within earshot. On the eastern flank, Dak Wren moved, and the word moved did not do justice to what happened, because Dak did not move the way living things move. He was there, and then he was somewhere else, and then he was somewhere else again, and the soldiers trying to track him saw after images, ghost copies of a teenage boy appearing and disappearing faster than their targeting systems could follow. He reached an armored column, 4 heavy vehicles with enough firepower to level a city block, and he dismantled them. Not destroyed, dismantled. He reached into each vehicle with his bare hands and removed the power core with the precision of a surgeon, pulling each one free from its housing without triggering a single safety system. And he placed the 4 cores in a neat stack by the side of the road, like a boy tidying his room. The vehicle crews sat in their dead machines and stared at the empty spaces where their power cores had been, and could not process what they had just witnessed. In the center of it all, Maren Engels stood with her eyes closed, and she did not fight. She did not need to. Every black-spine soldier within 200 meters felt her, not as pain and not as intrusion, but as a presence, warm and vast and impossibly gentle, like standing in sunlight that could think. She was in their minds, not reading their thoughts, but offering something, a feeling, a quiet suggestion that settled into the spaces between their anger and their fear. The feeling said, "You do not want to do this." It said, "This is not who you have to be." It said, "Put it down, and sit down, and rest." Half the mercenaries dropped their weapons and sat on the ground, and some of them wept, and they wept not from fear or pain, but from a sudden and overwhelming sense of shame, as if they had just woken from a long sleep and seen clearly, for the first time, what they had been doing with their lives. Gorath Mal watched his army collapse from the cockpit of his command walker, and the rage that had carried him this far burned through its last reserves and left something cold and hollow in its place. He aimed every weapon his walker carried at Jonah Wren and fired. Jonah took every shot, and each impact lit up his body like a star being born. And when the light cleared and the smoke drifted away, he was still standing. His shirt had burned away, and beneath it was not metal or armor, alien technology, just ordinary human skin, brown and weathered from years in the sun, completely unharmed. Jonah looked up at Gorath's cockpit, and his expression was not anger and not triumph and not satisfaction. It was disappointment, the quiet, heavy disappointment of someone who had given every chance and watched every chance be thrown away. Jonah reached up and took hold of the command walker's armored hatch, a hatch designed to withstand a direct artillery strike, and pulled it off with one hand, the way a person opens a jar. He reached inside and lifted Gorath Mal out of his seat, all 8 feet and 600 pounds of him, and set him on the ground the way a parent sets down a child who has been climbing somewhere dangerous. Gorath stood in the dirt and looked up at the human farmer who held him like he weighed nothing, and every truth he had ever believed about strength and power and who sits at the top of the food chain crumbled to dust inside. Jonah leaned close, and his voice was quiet, and it carried no malice at all. "Go home," he said. "Tell everyone what happened here. That is your punishment, Commander, to be the one who has to explain." Gorath Mal turned and walked toward the landing zone, and he did not look back. And behind him his soldiers were already running for the ships. Sarath was the last to leave. She stood at the boarding ramp of the last transport and looked back at Briar's Hollow, and what she saw broke something inside her and rebuilt it into a different shape. The humans were going back to their lives. Jonah Wren was already kneeling in his field again, hands in the dirt, planting as if the last 14 minutes had been a brief interruption, no more significant than a passing cloud. Lissa Cohn was calling children in for afternoon lessons, and her voice carried across the field, warm and clear. Dak was helping an old man carry something, and he was laughing about something. And the sound of his laughter was the most ordinary and the most terrifying thing Sarath had ever heard. They were not celebrating, and they were not standing over the defeated, and they were not even acknowledging that anything unusual had happened. They were just people living their lives in a small town on a quiet moon. And that was the thing that would keep Sereth awake for years to come. Not what the humans could do, but how little it seemed to matter to them. 6 months passed, and the galaxy did what the galaxy always does. It talked. Rumors travel faster than light in places like the Slab, because bad news is the only currency that never loses its value. And the story of what happened on Eren 4 spread through the mercenary stations and the war halls and the black market channels like a fire finding dry wood. At first, nobody believed it. A colony of farmers had defeated the Black Spine Collective, 500 armed professionals with heavy armor and orbital support, in 14 minutes without using a single weapon. It sounded like a joke, and for the first few weeks it was treated like one. Then people started looking at Gorath Mal. He was sitting in a bar on the Slab, the same station where he had taken the contract 6 months ago, and he was not the same creature who had sat in that briefing room and called the mission a vacation. He was thinner, and his bone-plated skin had taken on a gray pallor that made him look like something that had been left out in the rain too long, and his 4 eyes had a hollow quality that other mercenaries recognized, because they had seen it before, in soldiers who had walked into something they could not walk back out of. Other commanders approached him, because commanders are always hungry for intelligence, and they asked him about Eren 4, and Gorath told them the truth in a flat voice that carried no emotion at all. They measured his biosigns while he spoke, because trust is a luxury that killers cannot afford, and what the readings showed made them step back. His stress hormones spiked to near-lethal levels every time he described the battle, and his cardiac rhythm destabilized, and his neural activity showed patterns consistent with deep psychological trauma that no amount of time or treatment had been able to touch. He was not lying, and he was not exaggerating, and the people reading his biosigns knew it. Word spread faster after that. Within 3 months, no mercenary company in the quadrant would accept a contract against a human settlement. Not Briar's Hollow specifically, but any human settlement anywhere. It did not matter if the colony was 100 people on a frozen rock or 10,000 on a garden world, because the lesson of Eren 4 was not about one town, but about the nature of what humans were. You could not tell which ones were wardens, because they all looked the same, ordinary and soft and harmless, with their dirt-stained hands and their round glasses and their children running between their legs. Any one of them might be a farmer, and any one of them might be something that could catch plasma in its bare hand and pull the heart out of an armored walker without breaking a sweat. The mercenaries did the math, and the math was simple. There was no contract in the galaxy worth that risk. In the gleaming halls of the Galactic Union capital, the math was simple. Incident at Eren 4 forced an emergency session of the Grand Assembly, closed to public observers and sealed under the highest classification available. 12 species demanded that humanity be reclassified from Class 2 to its true rating, argued that the deception was a violation of Union Charter, and insisted that the humans be required to disclose the full extent of their capabilities. The human ambassador arrived for the session on time and alone. Her name was Yuki Tanaka, and she was small even by human standards, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair cut short, and a face that looked like it spent most of its time smiling at things other people did not notice. She wore a simple dark suit, and she carried no datapad and no notes, and she sat in her designated seat and folded her hands and waited for the assembly to address her. The Draelkin representative spoke first, and his voice shook the chamber. "Your species has been lying to this assembly for 400 years, he said. You asked to be classified as Class 2, when your true capabilities place you at Class 12 or beyond. Explain yourselves." Yuki Tanaka listened to the accusation and the anger behind it. And then she smiled the way someone smiles when a child asks why the sky is blue. Not with condescension, but with genuine warmth. "We are exactly what we have always told you we are," she said, and her voice was soft, but it reached every corner of that massive chamber without effort. "We are ordinary people who want to live in peace." She paused and looked around the room at the assembled representatives of 100 species, each one watching her with expressions that ranged from fury to terror to something very close to awe. "If the galaxy chooses to leave us in peace," she continued, "it will never need to see anything else." The chamber was silent for a long time. The motion to reclassify humanity was quietly withdrawn. The session was sealed, and the representatives filed out of the chamber without speaking to each other. And several of them would later describe the experience of being in the same room as Yuki Tanaka as unsettling in a way I cannot adequately describe. On Aaron 4, the seasons turned and life continued. Jonah Wren taught his son how to repair a fence in the late afternoon sun, and his hands were patient and steady. And Dak watched and learned and asked questions the way sons have always asked questions of their fathers. Maren Engel sat on her porch in the evening and read books, real books, made of paper, because she said screens made her eyes tired. And sometimes she looked up at the stars and smiled at something only she could see. Lissa Cohn ran her school, and her students learned mathematics and literature and history, and none of them knew that their teacher could walk through a plasma barrage without flinching, because some things are not part of the. There was no memorial for the battle, and there was no victory parade, and the children of Briar's Hollow did not know it had happened, because the adults had decided long ago that children should grow up believing that peace is the normal state of things, even if the adults have to fight to keep it that way. Sarath left the Blackspine Collective the week after Aaron 4 and became a wanderer. She moved through stations and ports and the quiet spaces between civilizations, carrying File 1 Sigma Terran on an encrypted chip that she kept close to her body at all times. And she lived a small and careful life that was nothing like the life she had lived before. Sometimes in the places she traveled, she would meet soldiers and mercenaries and warlords who talked about human space the way predators talk about territory they intend to claim. And when she heard this kind of talk, she would sit down uninvited and say one word: don't. Her, with the amusement or irritation that large, dangerous creatures show to small ones who speak out of turn. And they would ask why. And Sarath would lean forward, and her scales would go white the way they did whenever she remembered. And she would say the same thing every time. Because they will let you live, and that is worse. You will spend the rest of your life knowing that the only reason you are still breathing is because a farmer decided you were not worth killing. Some of them listened, and some of them did not, and the ones who did not listen learned the same lesson in their own time. In the deep black of space, beyond the Orion Spur, a Drelkin warfleet dropped out of hyperspace, 1,000 warships carrying enough firepower to crack a planet, commanded by Torvon K himself, who had decided that what mercenaries could not do, he would do with his own armada. They arrived at the edge of human space and powered up their weapons and prepared for the conquest that would make Torvon the most powerful warlord in the quadrant. They found a single vessel waiting for them. It was a human cargo shuttle, small and battered and unarmed, the kind of ship used to haul grain between colonies, and it hung in the void like a pebble in the path of an avalanche. A transmission came through on an open channel, and the voice was male and calm and carried the easy friendliness of someone offering directions to a lost traveler. "Hi there. We noticed you were headed our way, so we brought you something." The cargo shuttle opened its bay doors and released a single object into space. It was a power core, one of the 4 that Dak Wren had pulled from the Black Spine armored column with his bare hands 6 months ago. Still functional, still humming with energy, tumbling gently in the starlight. A text message was attached, and it appeared on the view screen of every ship in Torvon's fleet. Simultaneously. "This belongs to the last people who tried. We thought you should have it. Take a moment and think about what you would like to do next. We will wait. Torvon K. stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at the little cargo shuttle and the spinning power core and the message on his screen, and he thought about Goroth Maul's hollow eyes and the biosign readings that spiked toward death every time the mercenary remembered, and he thought about the quiet woman in the Galactic Union chamber who had smiled and said, "You will never need to see anything else." The fleet held position for 9 hours. No one fired, and no one spoke, and on 1,000 bridges, 1,000 commanders waited for Torvon to give an order that would define the rest of their lives. Then, one by one, starting with the ships at the edge of the formation and moving inward like a wave, the fleet began to turn. They jumped away in silence, back the way they had come. And the little cargo shuttle sat alone in the empty space and waited until the last ship was gone before closing its bay doors and flying home. In the months and years that followed, a new saying appeared across the galaxy. In bars and barracks and war rooms and the quiet places where soldiers go to be honest with each other. It was translated into 100 languages and carried by 1,000 tongues, and it meant the same thing in every one of them. It went like this: never fight a human, not because you will die, but because you will survive, and you will never stop remembering why they let you. And on Aaron 4, in a small town called Briar's Hollow, on a quiet moon that most of the galaxy had never heard of, Jonah Wren knelt in his field and planted seeds in the good soil, and did not look up at the stars. He did not need to. The stars had already learned to look away.